So you've probably wondered at some point where this whole smoking weed thing actually started, right? Like, who was the first person to look at this random plant and think, yeah, I'm gonna set that on fire and breathe it in? Well, buckle up, because this story goes back way further than you might think, and it's absolutely wild how cannabis has been woven into human history for thousands of years. Let's start at the very beginning. We're talking ancient times here, like really ancient. The cannabis plant itself probably originated in Central Asia, somewhere around modern-day Mongolia and southern Siberia. Scientists believe that humans first started interacting with cannabis somewhere between 8 and 12,000 years ago. But here's the thing, they probably weren't smoking it at first. Our ancestors were way more practical than that. They discovered that the fibers from the cannabis plant were incredibly strong and useful for making rope, textiles, and clothing. So the first relationship humans had with cannabis was actually pretty boring compared to what came later. The earliest solid evidence we have of people actually using cannabis for its psychoactive properties comes from ancient burial sites in China and Central Asia. Archaeologists have found cannabis plants and seeds in tombs dating back thousands of years, and it's pretty clear these weren't just there by accident. In the Yanghai tombs in China, which date back about 2,700 years, researchers discovered nearly 2 pounds of cannabis that had been carefully preserved. The really interesting part is that this cannabis showed signs of having been cultivated specifically for its psychoactive compounds. It wasn't hemp for rope, this was the good stuff, if you know what I mean. But the Chinese weren't necessarily smoking it in the way we think of smoking today. Ancient texts suggest they were burning cannabis in enclosed spaces and inhaling the smoke during shamanic rituals. Think of it like an ancient hotbox session, except with serious spiritual and ceremonial purposes. These shamans believed that the smoke could help them communicate with spirits, see the future, and gain wisdom from the divine. This wasn't recreational use in the modern sense, it was deeply tied to religious and spiritual practices. Now let's hop over to ancient India, because this is where things get really interesting. Cannabis has been used in India for at least 3,000 years, probably longer. The plant shows up in ancient Hindu texts called the Vedas, where it's described as one of the 5 sacred plants. They called it different names like Bhang, Ganja, and Haras, depending on how it was prepared. In Indian tradition, cannabis was associated with the god Shiva, who was said to have a particular fondness for the plant. According to legend, Shiva discovered cannabis after a family argument when he went to sleep under a cannabis plant and woke up feeling refreshed and enlightened. From that point on, cannabis became his favourite food, and he became known as the Lord of Bhang. Indian practitioners developed multiple ways to consume cannabis. Bhang is a drink made from grinding cannabis leaves and mixing them with milk, spices, and other ingredients. It's still consumed today during festivals like Holi. Ganja refers to the dried flowering tops that were smoked, usually in a chillum, which is a straight conical pipe. And charas is basically hand-rolled hash. The sophistication of these preparations shows that Indians weren't just randomly using this plant, they had developed an entire culture and methodology around it over centuries. Cannabis use in India wasn't just limited to religious contexts either. Ancient Indian medicine, known as Ayurveda, incorporated cannabis into treatments for all sorts of conditions. Ancient texts describe using cannabis to treat everything from pain and inflammation to anxiety and digestive issues. Indian physicians were incredibly detailed in their descriptions of how to prepare cannabis medicine and what conditions it could treat. This medical knowledge would eventually spread along trade routes to other parts of the world. Speaking of trade routes, let's talk about how cannabis spread across the ancient world. The Silk Road, that famous network of trade routes connecting East Asia to the Mediterranean, wasn't just moving silk and spices. cannabis seeds and knowledge about the plant travelled along these routes too. As traders, merchants and travellers moved between civilizations, they brought cannabis with them, sharing knowledge about its uses and effects. The Scythians, those badass nomadic warriors who roamed the steppes of Central Asia around 2,500 years ago, were serious cannabis enthusiasts. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote about their practices in fascinating detail. He described how the Scythians would construct small tents, place red-hot stones inside, throw cannabis seeds onto the stones, and then crawl inside to inhale the vapour. Herodotus wrote that they would howl with pleasure from the experience. Archaeological evidence backs this up. Burial sites of Scythian nobles have been found with elaborate golden vessels that contained burnt cannabis seeds. These weren't poor people getting high in some back alley. These were elites incorporating cannabis into their most important ceremonies. Now let's move to the Middle East and Africa, because cannabis made significant inroads there too. In ancient Egypt, there's evidence that cannabis was used medicinally. The Ebers Papyrus, an ancient Egyptian medical text from around 1500 BCE, mentions cannabis as a treatment for inflammation and other ailments. Whether ancient Egyptians smoked cannabis or used it in other ways is still debated, but we know they definitely knew about the plant and its properties. Cannabis really took off in the Islamic world during the medieval period. Now you might think that's surprising since Islam prohibits alcohol, but cannabis occupied a unique position. Some Islamic scholars argued that since cannabis wasn't specifically mentioned in the Quran, like alcohol was, it existed in a grey area. This led to cannabis use spreading throughout the Middle East and North Africa, particularly among Sufi mystics who used it to enhance their spiritual practices and achieve altered states of consciousness during their devotional activities. The word assassin actually might have connections to cannabis use, though this is controversial among historians. The story goes that a group of medieval warriors led by Hassan-i-Sabah were called hashashin, or hashish users, by their enemies, and this eventually evolved into our word assassin. Whether they actually used hashish before their missions is debated, but the linguistic connection shows how embedded cannabis was in Middle Eastern culture. In Africa, cannabis was called by various names and used in numerous ways across different cultures. The plant likely arrived in Africa through trade with India and the Middle East. In East Africa, cannabis became integrated into traditional medicine and social practices. Various African tribes used cannabis in healing rituals, and some warriors would consume cannabis before battle. The Pygmies in Central Africa used cannabis in religious ceremonies, believing it helped them communicate with spirits. Now here's where the story gets really interesting, because we need to talk about how cannabis made its way to the Americas. The plant didn't exist in the Western Hemisphere until Europeans brought it over. The Spanish brought hemp to their colonies in the 1500s, specifically for making rope and textiles. The English did the same thing. In fact, hemp was such an important crop that in the American colonies, farmers were sometimes required by law to grow it. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon, and Thomas Jefferson grew it at Monticello, though there's debate about whether they ever used it for anything other than industrial purposes. But the psychoactive use of cannabis in the Americas came through different routes. Mexican laborers introduced the practice of smoking cannabis to the American Southwest in the early 1900s. They called it marijuana, and it was part of their traditional medicine and recreational practices. As Mexican immigration increased during the Mexican Revolution, cannabis smoking spread to American communities. In the Caribbean, cannabis arrived with indentured servants from India in the 1800s. They brought their traditional practices with them, and cannabis became integrated into Caribbean culture. Rastafarians in Jamaica, who emerged as a religious movement in the 1930s, adopted cannabis as a sacred sacrament, calling it ganja, and believing it brought them closer to God. They based this partly on biblical interpretations and partly on the existing Indian traditions already present in Jamaica. Let's jump back to ancient and medieval Europe for a moment. Hemp cultivation was widespread in Europe for industrial purposes, but evidence of psychoactive use is much less clear. Some historians believe that ancient Germanic and Celtic peoples might have used cannabis in religious rituals, but the evidence is sparse. Medieval Europe was more focused on hemp as a resource for rope, sails, and cloth, rather than for any mind-altering properties. The psychoactive aspects of cannabis really didn't penetrate European culture in a major way until much later. The 1800s brought a new wave of cannabis interest in Europe and America, but this time through a different lens. Western doctors and intellectuals began encountering cannabis through their colonial activities in India and the Middle East. British doctors serving in India became fascinated by cannabis and its medical applications. An Irish physician named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy conducted extensive studies on cannabis in India in the 1830s and brought his findings back to England. He introduced cannabis to Western medicine, and it quickly became a popular pharmaceutical. Cannabis, tinctures and extracts became common medicines in Europe and America throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. You could walk into a pharmacy and buy cannabis preparations for all sorts of ailments like pain, anxiety, insomnia, and even menstrual cramps. Major pharmaceutical companies like Eli Lilly and Park Davis manufactured cannabis medicines. This was completely legal and socially acceptable. Your great-great-grandmother might have had cannabis tincture in her medicine cabinet and thought nothing unusual about it. But there was also a recreational and artistic side emerging. In Paris during the 1840s, a group called the Club des Hashishins met regularly to consume hashish and discuss their experiences. Members included famous writers and artists like Charles Baudelaire, Alexandre Dumas, and Victor Hugo. They weren't just getting high for fun, they were serious intellectuals exploring the boundaries of consciousness and creativity. They wrote extensively about their experiences, helping to create a certain mystique around cannabis in European artistic circles. American intellectuals and bohemians picked up on this trend. Fitzhugh Ludlow wrote a whole book called The Hashish Eater in 1857, describing his extensive experiments with cannabis extracts. The book was popular and introduced many Americans to the idea of cannabis as a consciousness-altering substance, rather than just a medicine or industrial crop. Now we get to the really complicated part of the story, which is how cannabis went from being a common medicine and occasionally used recreational substance to being demonized and prohibited. This transformation happened primarily in the early to mid-1900s, and it's tied up with racism, politics, and economic interests in ways that are honestly pretty disturbing when you look at the historical record. In the United States, the shift began in the early 1900s. As Mexican immigration increased, particularly during and after the Mexican Revolution, Americans in the Southwest encountered the practice of smoking cannabis. But instead of seeing it as just another custom, it became racialized. Authorities and media began associating marijuana use with Mexican immigrants and African American communities, particularly jazz musicians. They used this association to stoke racial fears and prejudices. Harry Anslinger, the first commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, became the face of cannabis prohibition in America. Starting in the 1930s, Anslinger launched an aggressive campaign against marijuana, and his rhetoric was shockingly racist by today's standards. He made claims about marijuana making minority populations violent and dangerous. He pushed stories about marijuana-crazed individuals committing horrible crimes. Much of what he said was either exaggerated or completely fabricated, but it was effective propaganda. The Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 effectively made cannabis illegal in the United States by imposing strict regulations and taxes that made it nearly impossible to legally possess or sell. This wasn't based on scientific evidence about the dangers of cannabis. In fact, when the American Medical Association testified before Congress, they argued against prohibition and pointed out that cannabis had legitimate medical uses and that there wasn't good evidence it was particularly dangerous. But their voices were drowned out by the moral panic that Anslinger and others had created. There were also economic factors at play. Some historians argue that industrial interests, particularly those in the emerging plastics and synthetic fibre industries, saw hemp as competition and supported prohibition for economic reasons. William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate who owned timber interests for paper production, published sensationalized anti-marijuana stories in his newspapers. Whether this was motivated by genuine concern or by business interests that would benefit from eliminating hemp as a competitor is still debated. Similar prohibition movements happened in other countries around the same time. International treaties in the early to mid-1900s increasingly classified cannabis as a dangerous drug that needed to be controlled. Often this was driven by Western powers, particularly the United States, pushing their prohibition policies onto other countries. But here's the ironic thing. During World War II, the US government actually encouraged American farmers to grow hemp again because it was needed for the war effort. They even produced a film called Hemp for Victory, promoting hemp cultivation. As soon as the war ended, though, prohibition came right back. The 1960s brought a huge shift in cannabis culture, at least in Western countries. The counterculture movement embraced marijuana as part of their rejection of mainstream values. College students, hippies, and anti-war protesters began using cannabis in large numbers. It became associated with peace, love, creativity, and opposition to the establishment. Musicians, artists, and intellectuals openly discussed their cannabis use. The Beatles, Bob Dylan, and countless other influential artists of the era were known to use cannabis. This created a really interesting cultural divide. Young people were increasingly viewing cannabis as relatively harmless and even beneficial, while older generations and authorities saw it as dangerous and immoral. This generational split continues to echo today. The so-called war on drugs, officially launched by President Nixon in the 1970s, specifically targeted marijuana along with other drugs. Again, there's evidence this was at least partially motivated by politics rather than public health. Nixon's aide John Ehrlichman later admitted that the drug war was designed to target anti-war protesters and black communities by criminalizing marijuana and associating these groups with drug use. The consequences of prohibition have been enormous. Millions of people have been arrested for marijuana possession over the past several decades. These arrests have disproportionately affected minority communities, even though research shows that people of all races use marijuana at similar rates. Criminal records for marijuana possession have destroyed careers, separated families, and perpetuated cycles of poverty and incarceration. All of this for a substance that most modern research suggests is less harmful than alcohol or tobacco. Medical research on cannabis was severely hampered by prohibition. Because cannabis was classified as a Schedule I drug in the United States, meaning it supposedly has no medical value and high potential for abuse, research became extremely difficult. Scientists who wanted to study cannabis had to jump through numerous bureaucratic hoops, and the cannabis they could legally study was often of poor quality. This meant that for decades, we had very limited scientific understanding of how cannabis actually works in the human body. things started to change in the 1990s with the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. Scientists found that the human body actually has receptors specifically designed to interact with cannabinoids, and that the body produces its own cannabinoid-like compounds. This was a huge discovery. It explained why cannabis has such varied effects on the body and suggested that cannabinoids might indeed have legitimate medical applications. The endocannabinoid system is involved in regulating all sorts of bodily functions, including pain, mood, appetite, memory, and immune response. This scientific progress, combined with changing public attitudes, led to a new wave of medical marijuana legalization starting in California in 1996. Patients with conditions like cancer, chronic pain, epilepsy, and multiple sclerosis reported that cannabis helped relieve their symptoms when other treatments hadn't worked. As more states legalized medical marijuana and more patients tried it, the evidence mounted that cannabis did indeed have medical value despite its Schedule I classification. The stories of medical marijuana patients have been particularly powerful in changing public opinion. Parents whose children suffer from severe epilepsy found that CBD, one of the non-psychoactive compounds in cannabis, could dramatically reduce seizures when nothing else worked. Cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy found that cannabis helped with nausea and appetite loss. Veterans with PTSD reported that cannabis helped them manage their symptoms. These weren't people looking to get high, these were sick people finding relief. This brings us to the modern era of cannabis legalization. Starting with Colorado and Washington in 2012, some US states began legalizing cannabis for recreational use, not just medical purposes. This was revolutionary. For the first time since Prohibition began, adults in these states could legally purchase and use cannabis without needing a medical reason. The sky didn't fall, crime didn't spike, society didn't collapse. In fact, these states collected significant tax revenue from legal cannabis sales and freed up law enforcement resources to focus on serious crimes. As of 2025, a growing number of states have legalized recreational cannabis, and even more allow medical use. Other countries have made similar moves. Canada legalized cannabis nationally in 2018. Uruguay did it even earlier in 2013. Several European countries have decriminalized possession or allow medical use. The global trend is clearly moving away from strict prohibition, though progress is uneven and many countries still have harsh penalties for cannabis possession. The legal cannabis industry has exploded into a multi-billion-dollar business. We've gone from people buying whatever they could get from illegal dealers to sophisticated dispensaries offering dozens of different strains, each with specific effects and cannabinoid profiles. Edibles, vapes, tinctures, topicals, you can get cannabis in almost any form imaginable now. There are cannabis beverages, cannabis-infused chocolates, even cannabis suppositories. The level of product development and innovation has been remarkable. This commercialization has its critics, though. Some people worry that big marijuana will become just like big tobacco, aggressively marketing addictive products without regard for public health. There are concerns about corporate consolidation, where small craft growers get pushed out by large companies. There are also serious equity issues, where the same communities that were most harmed by prohibition aren't getting access to the legal cannabis industry. White entrepreneurs are getting rich selling weed, while black and brown folks are still serving prison sentences for doing the same thing. The potency of cannabis has increased dramatically over the decades too. The marijuana available in the 1960s and 70s typically had THC levels of around 2 to 4%. Modern strains can have THC levels of 20, 25, even 30% or more. Some concentrates are over 90% THC. This has led to debates about whether today's cannabis is fundamentally different from historical cannabis, and whether these high-potency products pose greater risks, especially for young people whose brains are still developing. Speaking of young people, one of the big questions in the legalization debate has been whether legal cannabis would lead to increased youth use. The data so far has been somewhat reassuring. Most studies haven't found significant increases in teen cannabis use in states that have legalized. Some have even found decreases. This might be because legal markets are regulated and require ID checks, whereas illegal dealers don't care how old you are. However, this is an area that requires continued monitoring and research. The relationship between cannabis and mental health is another complex area getting increased attention. There's evidence that heavy cannabis use, especially starting at a young age, may be associated with increased risk of mental health issues, including anxiety, depression, and psychosis in some people. However, causation is tricky to establish. Do these conditions lead people to self-medicate with cannabis, or does cannabis contribute to developing these conditions, or is it some combination of both? And how much does individual biology matter, with some people being more vulnerable to negative effects than others? Research into therapeutic applications of cannabis continues to expand. Scientists are studying whether cannabinoids might help with conditions ranging from chronic pain and inflammation to PTSD, anxiety, and neurodegenerative diseases. Some of the most promising research involves CBD rather than THC, as CBD has therapeutic effects without producing a high. CBD has become hugely popular in recent years, showing up in everything from coffee to face cream, though the regulatory status remains murky, and many products contain less CBD than claimed or aren't properly tested for contaminants. The question of whether cannabis is a gateway drug, leading users to try harder drugs, has been debated for decades. The scientific consensus has shifted significantly on this question. While it's true that most people who use hard drugs probably used cannabis first, the vast majority of cannabis users never progress to other drugs. It's correlation, not causation. The gateway theory seems to have more to do with the fact that in illegal markets, the same dealers might sell multiple drugs, and the stigma around cannabis use might make other drug use seem less serious. In legal markets, where cannabis is separate from the illegal drug trade, this dynamic changes. One fascinating area of ongoing research is how different cannabinoids and terpenes, the aromatic compounds in cannabis, work together to produce different effects. This is called the entourage effect. Different strains produce different experiences, not just because of THC content, but because of the specific combination of compounds present. Some strains are more energizing, others more sedating. Some help with creativity, others with pain relief. The traditional distinction between indica and sativa strains, while popular, is probably less meaningful than the specific chemical profile of each individual strain. Indigenous peoples in various parts of the world are also reclaiming their traditional relationships with cannabis and other plants. For many Native American tribes, cannabis fits into existing traditions of using sacred plants for healing and ceremony. Some tribes on reservations are developing their own cannabis industries, seeing it as an economic opportunity and a way to exercise sovereignty. This connects back to those ancient traditions we talked about at the beginning, completing a sort of circle where indigenous knowledge about plant medicine is being validated after centuries of suppression. The environmental impact of cannabis cultivation is another important consideration. Growing cannabis requires significant resources, especially water and energy. Indoor grows in particular use enormous amounts of electricity for lighting and climate control. As the industry has scaled up, this has created environmental concerns, especially in places like California, where water is scarce. the industry is working on becoming more sustainable through techniques like outdoor and greenhouse growing, renewable energy, water reclamation, and organic growing practices, but there's still a long way to go. Looking at the international picture, we see huge variation in approaches to cannabis. Some countries have moved toward decriminalization or legalization, while others maintain extremely harsh penalties. In some Asian countries, possession of even small amounts of cannabis can result in death penalty or decades in prison. These disparities create bizarre situations where something is completely legal in one jurisdiction and can destroy your life in another. This is especially challenging in the era of global travel and communication. The story of cannabis is really a story about humanity itself, about our relationship with plants and nature, about how we decide what's acceptable and what's forbidden, about racism and social control, about medicine and healing, about pleasure and consciousness, about commerce and regulation. It touches on so many aspects of human culture and society that it's impossible to tell the story simply. What's remarkable is how this plant that humans have been using for thousands of years, that was once a common medicine found in every pharmacy, became so demonized and prohibited for much of the 20th century and is now coming back into acceptance. We're essentially rediscovering knowledge that our ancestors had. Ancient Indian physicians knew cannabis could help with pain and anxiety. Chinese shamans knew it could alter consciousness and facilitate spiritual experiences. Modern research is confirming many of these traditional uses while also discovering new applications. There's still so much we don't know. Despite thousands of years of human cannabis use, we're only beginning to understand the science of how it works. We don't fully understand the long-term effects of regular use, especially of today's high-potency products. We don't know the optimal doses for different medical conditions. We don't understand why some people seem to benefit from cannabis while others have negative experiences. We don't know the best ways to regulate a legal market to maximize benefits while minimizing harms. One thing that seems clear from history is that prohibition didn't work. Despite decades of criminalization, millions of people continued using cannabis anyway. The illegal market thrived, generating billions in revenue for criminal organizations while generating nothing for society. Countless people were incarcerated, disproportionately from minority communities. Medical research was stifled. Patients who could have benefited from cannabis therapy couldn't access it. All of this to prevent people from using a plant that humans have safely used for thousands of years. The move toward legalization and regulation seems more aligned with historical patterns. Throughout most of human history, cannabis existed as one of many plants that people used for various purposes. It wasn't free from regulation. Traditional societies often had rules about who could use it, when, and for what purposes, but it wasn't treated as this unique evil that needed to be stamped out. Modern legalization attempts to create a middle path where cannabis is available for those who want it, regulated to ensure safety and keep it away from kids, taxed to generate revenue for society, while also addressing the harms caused by decades of prohibition. The future of cannabis is likely to see continued expansion of legal markets, more sophisticated research into therapeutic applications, better understanding of risks and benefits, and hopefully more equitable access to both the medicine and the economic opportunities. We might see cannabis-based pharmaceuticals that are precisely dosed and formulated for specific conditions. We might see cannabis beverages replacing alcohol for some people. We might see it integrated into wellness practices and therapy. At the same time, we need to be thoughtful about this transformation. Just because something is natural and has been used for thousands of years doesn't mean it's harmless. Cannabis is a powerful substance that affects the brain and body in complex ways. Some people develop problematic relationships with it. Young people whose brains are still developing are potentially vulnerable to negative effects. People with certain mental health conditions may find cannabis makes their symptoms worse. Driving under the influence of cannabis impairs judgment and reaction time, creating safety risks. The key is finding balance, using the lessons of history while applying modern scientific understanding. Ancient cultures that used cannabis typically did so within social and cultural frameworks that governed its use. They didn't let kids use it freely. They often reserved it for specific contexts, whether religious ceremonies, medical treatment, or adult social gatherings. Modern legalization needs similar frameworks, using regulation instead of prohibition to shape use in ways that maximize benefits and minimize harms. What's exciting is that we're living through a pivotal moment in the long history of human cannabis use. After a century of prohibition and stigma, we're rebuilding knowledge, re-establishing legal markets, and reconsidering our relationship with this plant. Future generations will look back at this period as a turning point, just as we look back at the beginning of prohibition and wonder what they were thinking. The story comes full circle in a way. From those ancient shamans in China burning cannabis in enclosed spaces to communicate with spirits, to modern scientists studying cannabinoid receptors in the brain, we're working with the same plant towards similar goals, trying to heal, trying to understand consciousness, trying to improve human well-being. The methods have changed, become more sophisticated, more scientific, but the fundamental impulse remains. So when did people start smoking weed? Thousands of years ago, in multiple places around the world, developing their own unique practices and traditions. Why did they start? For medicine? For spirituality? For pleasure? For consciousness exploration? For social bonding? Why did it become illegal? For reasons that had more to do with politics, racism, and economic interests than with the actual dangers of the plant. Why is it becoming legal again? Because prohibition failed? Because research showed medical value? Because public attitudes changed? Because the costs of criminalization became too high to justify? The cannabis story is far from over. We're still in the early stages of understanding this plant and figuring out its proper role in modern society. But one thing history makes clear is that cannabis has been intertwined with human culture for thousands of years and isn't going anywhere. The question isn't whether humans will use cannabis, history shows we will, but rather how we use it, under what conditions, with what safeguards, and toward what ends. That's the conversation we're having now, and it's one of the most interesting policy and cultural debates of our time.